Before we get into today's story, I'd just like to take a moment to discuss some of the details that you'll be hearing today. Now, I know you guys are used to me coming on here and giving a warning before each video, but I also know that there are a lot of new people to the channel, so they might not know exactly what to expect when they watch one of these. It's just something that I've seen in the comments, and I want to make sure that people do take the warning seriously, because trust me, I understand. The details are a bit much most of the time. I'd also like to take a moment to say thank you to the families who have been reaching out to me recently, letting me know that they'd like me to cover some of these stories. It's something I truly appreciate. Thank you for thinking of me. And I will always handle these stories with the utmost respect. Some of the clips you'll see in today's video might look a little familiar if you've been on this channel before. And I put them there because I needed people to see how much the same thing continues to happen over and over and over again, especially when it comes to children. With that being said, I do have to warn that today's video does have a lot of details concerning mental and physical abuse that will be very hard for a lot of people to make it through. So please, before jumping in, viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Could have been avoided. The city and everything should have somebody in there watching those kids.
Why, when they hear the kids crying, why right away they didn't call the cops? Let them come in and stop this before this happened to her now.
Inside the church, the closed casket of 6-year-old Elisa Izquierdo, hundreds of mourners, and a priest who asked for the mourners' compassion and understanding for Elisa's mother, Awilda Lopez.
I don't know what demons occupy this defendant, or did, or the kind of pain that she must have suffered in the past to bring her to what I consider rage.
Others say the system also failed Lopez.
The thousands of mothers like Awilda that are not getting the counsel, they're not getting the care. It involves too much money.
I think that these people could have did something. I'm sorry to say, if you call BCW many a times and BCW didn't come, what about going to get a cop? What about going to call somebody? They would have came in.
Here's a difficult story to fathom. A New York mother is charged with starving her 4-year-old daughter to death. Carla Lockwood reportedly admitted to the murder because she neither loved nor wanted the child. Lockwood told authorities she had not fed the little girl in a year.
Solorzano covered her face and had nothing to say leaving court after watching her daughter Cynthia Arce plead not guilty to murder. Solorzano discovered the violence in her Mamaroneck home April 28th. According to a handwritten police report attached to the autopsy papers, Solorzano returned home and saw the toddler in bed, quote, surrounded by stuffed toys. Arce had cut herself and was in a bloody bathtub. In court, she wore a turtleneck, but it didn't cover the scars where she slashed her neck. At one point, the defense attorney said he thought psychological testing would delay the start of the trial for many months.
Over the decades, we've all heard and seen the reports of people who commit unthinkable crimes, and mental illness is often viewed as the reason for it. It's a huge factor in a lot of cases, from the most high-profile stories to the ones that were quickly forgotten. Tragedies like these often leave those in the community scarred for years to come. Some end up feeling like they wish they could have done more to help, while others act as if they had no idea anything was ever wrong to begin with. In November of 1993, residents of Bangor, Maine were readying themselves for the Thanksgiving holiday, just about a week and a half away. This would normally be that time of the year when families have loved ones in their homes and many are reconnecting, enjoying food and festivities. But that year, the holiday would be a lot different from those prior, because while many would try to mask their grief with smiles and laughs, in the back of their minds was the young girl whose face they just couldn't get out of their heads, an innocent child whose last days were cruel and unfathomable. And worst of all, every single day that this baby suffered went completely undetected by neighbors and an entire neighborhood. But was that really the case? After the horrors unfolded, everybody in the neighborhood would know this child's name, but as often is the case, it would be far too late to save her life. On today's episode of Evil Intentions, this is The Girl in the Window, the story of Tavielle Kigas.
in which someone in the throes of mental illness kills.
Tavielle was starved to death. She too served time at the mental institution.
Tavielle Kigas was born on March 23rd of 1988 in Maine. She was born to a woman named Tavielle Kigas, 28 years old. They resided at 55 Moosehead Boulevard in Bangor, Maine. If you find yourself traveling to or through Bangor, you'll have a wide variety of options when it comes to things to keep you busy. The area offers everything from local family-owned shops to different restaurants to a good selection of breweries, and even offers lodging if you're looking to stay the night and plan more sightseeing. You might find yourself visiting the 31-foot-high Paul Bunyan statue on Main Street, since Bangor is just one of the places he was said to have been born. His birth certificate even sits on display at Bangor City Hall. Maine is also home to famed writer Stephen King. He was born 2 hours away in Portland, but references to Bangor are all over his films, from the Paul Bunyan statue mentioned, to Mount Hope Cemetery, to the sewer drain that inspired that classic scene in the movie It. You can also visit Roland F. Perry City Forest, also known as Bangor City Forest, which has over 17 miles and 680 acres of different trails. The large area is filled with different wildlife and beautiful scenic views. This was where Tavielle called home. She was described by those who met her as a pleasant, giggly, and a chatty 5-year-old, a child who loved talking to people she just met and having conversations with her mother, an active and intelligent child who always seemed to be happy. She sometimes went by the nickname Tavi. While Maine was home to them, Tavielle Kigas, her mother, was originally from the South, traveling from Bamberg, South Carolina, somewhere with a much smaller population of under 4,000 people in 1993, versus Bangor, which had a population of over 34,000 people. The move made sense given her connection to Maine, because back on July 16th of 1986, Kigas became married to Tavielle's father, and he was from Bangor. So she made the move here because it seemed like a good place to raise a child and have a thriving relationship. But things wouldn't go exactly as planned once the relocation was complete. Over the years, living in this new neighborhood wasn't the easiest thing, because Tanaya didn't really know anybody and she didn't have family here. But as time went on, neighbors would try their best to make her feel at home. People who lived by Kigas and her daughter would begin to build a friendship with her, inviting her out, opening their home to her, and trying as best as they could to involve her in plans. One neighbor stated that when she was still living near them, she and Kigas became so close that they were practically like sisters, confiding in one another whenever possible. It was said that while Kigas came to Bangor for Tavielle's father, he never lived at their home with them. He was never really seen much, and some took notice of that. It was stated that he abandoned her and their child. The family of her husband lived nearby, but she wasn't close to them. Despite becoming close to one or two people, she wasn't a part of any social circles in the neighborhood, and she didn't have any real support from loved ones. Over time, the very few who had gotten to know Tavielle Kigas would notice a sudden change in her. She was acting very different, very withdrawn, and when they did interact with her, it was very bizarre. But they had no idea how much worse this would all become. As time went on, Kigas and her daughter were seen less and less. Some recall seeing them travel on the city bus and running errands around the area from time to time, but that was pretty much it. It was apparent that she had no interest in maintaining friendships with these people. What made it obvious was a situation that unfolded in the spring of 1992. This was when Kigas was over at a next-door neighbor's home, talking with her neighbor and her neighbor's boyfriend. The conversation was normal at first, but then, out of nowhere, Kigas would start to accuse the woman and her boyfriend of being Satan worshippers. It was a strange and very random accusation. It created a tension between them, so understandably, the neighbor felt that the best thing for everyone was if Kigas went home. The neighbor placed her hand on Kigas' shoulder, asking her politely to leave the home. This is when, without warning, Kigas, holding a set of keys between her fingers, punched her neighbor in the face, opening up her forehead, causing her to bleed. The situation escalated very quickly, and the police were called. At first, she was going to be charged with assault, but the case was quickly dismissed by the district attorney after being investigated because he believed that Kigas' neighbor was the one who instigated the fight. After this, the neighbors didn't hear anything else about that case. Before all of this, the couple would see Kigas and Tavielle all the time, and they were all on good terms. The sudden change in personality and her behavior was out of the blue, for them at least. Her actions would begin to trickle down to Tavielle, who was just a child who wanted to make friends and be a kid. Unfortunately, that would never happen. Due to the violent interaction Kigas had with her neighbors, both parties were summoned to the offices of the Bangor Housing Authority to address what took place. According to those neighbors, at the end of that meeting, both them and Kigas were threatened with eviction if there were any more complaints made. It seemed they just wanted no part of whatever was going on, but that wouldn't be the last time that police were called to the location. In the winter of 1992, months after the incident in her neighbor's home, those same neighbors would make a call to 911, stating that Tavielle was left home alone and her mother was nowhere to be found. They thought twice about even making that phone call out of fear of being evicted, but after about 15 minutes, they called authorities. They knew she was home alone because they had seen her in the window, and Kigas wasn't there. They had seen her leave sometime before this. It struck them as wrong to leave a 5-year-old all alone when anything could happen. The officers who arrived and took the report stated that they would be reporting this to Child Welfare Services, but for whatever reason, that couldn't be confirmed. The neighbors felt that it was possibly just disregarded. As tensions grew, it came to a point where these neighbors wanted no trouble, but they were often taunted by Kigas, as if she wanted them to try and call 911 again, since she knew that they could possibly be facing eviction and would likely think twice, which they did. As time went on, this happened more and more. Kigas isolating herself and her daughter from others. It only got worse. There were no more conversations, and Tavielle was no longer allowed to play with any of the kids in the neighborhood. Neighbors tried inviting them to birthday parties for their children, but to no avail. Some felt she was just very overprotective of her child, since she once mentioned the other kids playing too rough. But no matter how many attempts were made to build a friendship or any type of trust, it did no good. Neighbors barely saw them around anymore, something that felt very off from the day it began. It was also clear that Tavielle wouldn't be allowed to interact with them or the kids, and it didn't look like it was changing anytime soon. Kigas refused to talk to anyone and refused help with different things. For example, when she was offered a free washing machine and help with mowing her lawn, she didn't want the help. On top of that, Kigas and her husband would get divorced. Like any separation or breakup, this was a harsh blow, and it seemed like it only added to everything already going on. Things with her became progressively worse. The same neighbors that she had that incident with back in 1992 noticed how much her anger and frustration was being taken out on her daughter. They described one time, just one, where they witnessed the mother and daughter outside playing with a frisbee, but after 1 or 2 tosses, Kigas would yell at Tavielle to get back inside because she was annoyed by her not knowing how to throw a frisbee correctly. Instead of being allowed out with the other kids, she was locked in her bedroom. All Tavielle could do from here was look out of the window, waving at the other children as they passed by. Even then, she tried to keep a smile on her face. She would hold up her doll from the window and greet the neighbors and their kids, trying to have some sort of interaction with the outside world, mouthing out words from her bedroom, trying to have conversations. The kids waved back, confused as to why she wasn't out there with them, why they were seeing her locked inside her room more and more. Pretty soon, they would become used to seeing her that way. She never went to the park, never went swimming on those sweltering summer days. She was just indoors all the time, the lonely child who seemed to now be a prisoner in her own home. It was like a dark cloud that hovered over everyone who lived here. Many knew exactly how things had changed and the effect it was having on this 5-year-old. They would learn just how horrific things had become for little Tavi. In September of 1993, Tavielle was on her way to kindergarten at Down East School at 100 Moosehead Boulevard, just down the road. Here were many kids who lived nearby that she would be able to learn with and get to know. While in school, to teachers and to counselors, things seemed normal. No signs anything was wrong. Tavielle was her happy and chatty self, according to them, and the other kids in her class liked her. But that wouldn't last very long, because just a month later, in early October of 1993, Tavielle Kigas placed a call to her school and told them Tavielle would no longer be attending kindergarten there because she had the flu and she would be moving her to Miami. She was immediately pulled out of class. What those other kids and teachers didn't know was that Tavi was on her way to suffering a truly cruel fate. As soon as she was pulled out, the child who many were used to seeing in good spirits in the past was now receiving constant beatings and always being punished. This was because Kigas believed that her daughter was possessed by the devil. A perfectly normal 5-year-old was now seen as evil for no reason at all. Over the next month, from early October when she was taken out of class to mid-November of 1993, Tavielle was again back in her room, only able to look out of the window to try and see a friendly face or two. Except this time, after the beatings, her mother decided that she would just stop feeding her. No food, no water, and no care in the world. For over 30 days, she was locked in that bedroom and never given a meal, being ignored as if she didn't even exist. While the other kids in her class were learning about Thanksgiving and getting ready to have feasts with their families in a few weeks, Tavielle had nothing but her thoughts, her hunger, and her suffering. At just the tender age of 5, she had no idea why she was being treated this way. On November 8th of 1993, after a month of having not a single thing to eat, Tavielle began to scream at the top of her lungs in desperation, in need of help. It was said that she had access to just water from a bathroom for a short while, but not the entire month that she was being neglected. But she had no energy since she wasn't eating. She would become so weak that she couldn't even make her way to the bathroom anymore. By this point, Tabby would have been suffering from the effects of severe dehydration and starvation. The fatigue, confusion, weakness, drastic weight loss, dizziness, chills, and even depression. Her screams were likely due to what she was feeling and possibly seeing as her life faded away. Whenever her so-called mother heard those screams, she would pop her head into Tavielle's bedroom and tell her she was going to die, unless she showed some respect. And then she would put on some loud music to mask her screams. She went about her business, carrying on with daily routines as if her daughter was the last thing on her mind. That loud music and Tavielle's screams would go on for days, and supposedly, neighbors didn't hear any of it. On Friday, November 12th of 1993, at around 11 a.m., Tavielle's screams were no more. The music was turned off, and the home was now eerily quiet. After slipping into a coma when her screams stopped, her heart would stop beating. Tavielle was gone. After more than 30 days of being neglected, beaten, and starved, her suffering had finally come to an end. Throughout all of this, there was no communication with others. Neighbors would begin to see Kigas' mail stack up, since she either wasn't around to pick it up or just didn't care to. Except for one light being turned on at some point in the month of November, there were no signs that anyone was home. They also noticed that for a while now, they hadn't seen Tabby looking out of her window. It was as if she just disappeared, almost without a trace. Of course, what they didn't know was that from October to November, there was someone home, a starving child, who was just slowly dying in her room, all alone. And if her mother was home, she just ignored her, letting her suffer. Even after her daughter was gone, Kigas went about her days as if all was well. On Sunday, November 14th, just 2 days after Tavielle died, Tavielle Kigas took a cab from a variety store not far from her home over to the airport mall. This was said to be around 6 p.m. While here, she would stop at another store at the mall to cash a check, and then took that same cab back to the front of her home. She was seen by a neighbor exiting the cab and walking into her house, but they noticed that Tavielle wasn't with her. These neighbors had no idea that the child had already died of starvation. It would be on November 15th of 1993, 3 days after her daughter died, that Kigas would pick up the phone and dial 911. The dispatcher asked her what her emergency was, and she would reply that she was calling to report that her daughter was dead, and she wanted to know what to do with the body. Authorities would arrive at 55 Moosehead Boulevard a short while later, finding Tavielle's small, malnourished body lying in the middle of the bedroom floor. She was found fully dressed, wearing a hat with socks on her feet and on her hands. Her face was covered with a piece of cloth, done by Kigas, so she wouldn't have to see her face when she walked in and out of the room in the days after. Her body was emaciated with the lack of water, causing the tips of her toes and fingers to become partially mummified. Around 4:30 p.m. that same day, neighbors watched as her small body was carried out of her home in a body bag. Tavielle Kigas was arrested and taken in for questioning, and what they learned during that interrogation would make matters even worse, if you could believe it. The interview lasted 2 hours, and here she detailed what took place. She confessed right away to purposely starving her daughter. She also said she didn't care what happened to her daughter after. She stated that everyone always spoke about how beautiful and bright Tavi was, and the way she said it, it was almost as if she was jealous of her own daughter. She said the following: "I made up my mind I wasn't going to feed her. I didn't murder her. I just let her die naturally. Tavi became evil. The more I did out of love for her, the more she hated me. She manipulated me, stabbed me in the back, and hated me because I wasn't a white woman. You see a very different child at school than I see at home." She would go on to describe how small Tavielle had become and how she cleaned her body and covered her eyes after she died because they were bulging out. She would then begin mimicking the sounds the child made as she fought for her life. It sounded like she was fighting it, like she was possessed, like she was fighting God. I told her she was going to die, and why, and she told me she didn't want to die, but never asked God to forgive her. She had suffered so much since she was conceived, and I knew she had to suffer one last time. She would then turn up the radio as loud as possible so she couldn't hear a thing. She showed no emotion as she spoke about it. It seemed as if she was satisfied with this outcome, knowing her daughter suffered, not caring at all. When she was asked if she had told anybody about her plot to starve her daughter, her response was, "No way." She was then charged with the murder of Tavielle and taken to the county jail straight away. On Thursday, November 18th of 1993, a service was held for Tavi at the Fairview Cemetery in VZ, Maine. More than 100 people, most of whom never met her, showed up to pay respects for the innocent child, who in life wasn't even allowed to speak to anyone. Onlookers surrounded the small white casket where her body was placed. 5 pink balloons, one for every year she lived, were attached to her casket. Everything from stuffed animals to long-stem roses to bouquets of flowers were left on top. The 5 balloons were given to 5 people who looked on while the Reverend said the following: "God's love does not end when you and I walk away from this grave. Tavi is in God's hands. She is at peace. Tavielle Kigas shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let her go." The balloons were then released into the sky. In the days following Tavielle's shocking death, neighbors expressed their grief, saying they would be forever haunted by the visions of the young girl that they would always see in the window. Many found themselves trying to cope with the loss, feeling like they knew deep inside that something like this was going to happen one day. One neighbor was quoted as saying, "Every day we have to look at that window. It's hard to eat, and it's hard to sleep." Others would say that she led a short and awful life, indicating that people knew what she was going through, on some level at least. While Tavielle didn't have many friends, the news was very hard on the children who went to her school. They couldn't quite understand the concept of what was done to her, but they said her name often. One child was quoted as saying, "Here we are talking about Thanksgiving and having big meals, and this girl's mommy wouldn't feed her anything." It was clear that the cruel nature of the crime took its toll on the entire community. It would spark many opinions on how to handle a situation like this. Many felt that neighbors were tight-lipped and made a choice to not say anything about what they might have heard. Others felt like it was too late to start feeling bad. If they could have said something, they should have. It was odd that nobody called or complained while music was blasting for 2 or 3 days straight. The principal of the Down East school stated that when this was happening, she went to the home, looking through windows and knocking on the door to see what was going on. She got no response. It's unknown if she visited when the child was already deceased, but she did try. While many battled with the guilt and grief of what took place right next door, this was about Tabby, and now nothing could bring her back. On Friday, December 10th of 1993, during her arraignment, Tavielle Kigas pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Defense attorney stated that she was not criminally responsible for her daughter's death due to, quote, paranoid schizophrenia causing her to make decisions that weren't grounded in reality. She would be ordered to undergo further psychological evaluation to see if this was true, and she was sent to the Bangor Mental Health Institute while she awaited her fate. On Monday, June 12th of 1995, Tavielle Kigas was headed to trial to answer to her charges. The trial would be overseen by a superior court judge and not a jury. It would last a little over a week, and experts were called to the stand to see if her mental state played a role in the sickening crime. During her trial, the 2-hour videotaped interview was shown to the few allowed in the courtroom. When some of her relatives entered the courtroom, Kigas would wave and smile at them, still showing no emotion. Tavielle's grandparents sobbed as they listened to the details straight from Kigas' mouth. While the defense would say that she wasn't responsible thanks to her mental state, the prosecution would say that while she may have had some mental issues, she knew exactly what she was doing. It was premeditated, and she should be held responsible for it. Throughout the trial, Kigas would deliver more bizarre statements, with the defense saying that she heard God's voice imitating her daughter, and saying she heard her neighbors, the ones that she believed were devil worshippers, chanting that she was pregnant. She would state that Tavielle died for disrespecting her and God. Kigas would also tell doctors that she believed the jazz musician Pat Metheny was God, and she was pregnant with his baby. She even wrote the musician multiple letters, though what was stated in those letters wasn't revealed. After a while, she said she believed he could read her thoughts and was talking to her telepathically. She often heard voices in her head telling her these things. She also believed that while in jail, guards were trying to poison her food to take her life. When it came to her being pregnant by a jazz musician she's never even met, it was said that this was only touched on and not further explored, even if this could have been seen as a clear sign that she was insane. During testimony, it was revealed that she always suffered from mental illness, going as far back as 8 years old, and it only seemed to worsen, reaching a peak in 1990 and onward. Neighbors also testified about their encounters with Kigas. In a surprising move, throughout her time at the Bangor Mental Health Institute, she was even allowed to visit Tavielle's grave, since doctors thought it might help her. Due to testimony by the doctors and everything that was revealed, Tavielle Kigas would be found not guilty by reason of insanity and was remanded to the custody of the Bureau of Mental Health for as long as it would take for them to determine if she was no longer a threat to others or herself. Over the years, she would make several attempts to get leniency in her sentence, which they would eventually agree to, even allowing her to make decisions with her medication. She was given less supervision and was allowed to leave a supervised group home and instead move into an apartment where staff would be available to tend to her if needed. She was allowed to work for 15 to 20 hours a week. This would eventually lead to her seeking her release, and in May of 2014, she was freed from state custody. A scholarship fund was created in memory of Tavielle in order to provide financial assistance to former, present, and all future students of Down East School where she attended. The funds raised would be used for summer camps and eventually even a playground. Several sources were tapped and many came together to make this happen. Even years after she was gone, it was clear that what happened to Tavi had a huge impact on the community, and many had no intention on ever forgetting her. From the Bronx to Washington Heights to the Lower East Side, from Brooklyn to Long Island to Maine, you hear these details, and it feels like you're hearing the same exact story being told over and over. It never gets any easier to hear. Sad to say, It seems these horror stories will never stop hitting the pages of our newspapers. It feels like there's no fix and no end in sight because it's still happening now. As hard as these stories are to hear, the discussion can't stop. If you ever witness or suspect that something like this is happening, please find a way, any way, to bring it to someone's attention. It can be a child suffering their very last moments, and a phone call just might be their only hope. If alive today, Tavi would be 36 years old. Rest in peace, Tavielle Kigas. You aren't forgotten.